So what if how many angels can dance on the head of a pin is, after all, a very helpful question. Oh, I know we've been trained to regard it otherwise, to the extent that we've been trained to regard it at all. But what if you've not heard the question or asked it yourself, let me explain. You'll typically only find it in conversations attempting to mock the finer points of theological reflection, to make fun of or pour contempt on the unproductive speculations of theologians, especially medieval or scholastic ones, often imagined locked away in an ivory tower, stroking their long beards, engage in extended discussions about fruitless questions such as, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? I confess that until very recently, this was the only way I ever used the question, to express how scholars can sometimes get lost in irrelevant questions, while the world outside wastes away needing the very answers that theology is supposed to provide. A silly question example number one is typically, can God create a rock so heavy that even he can't move it? And the second culprit, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Now, I have no interest in redeeming all such questions. Many of them are indeed stupid. But not this one, or so I am inclined to think. What if, when it comes to this question, we have been wrong? For one thing, it was a question that at least some of our forefathers considered worth the effort. And if G.K. Chesterton is right, that the church is the thing that saves us from the degrading slavery of being children of our times, then we should probably pay attention to those in our own faith family whose times engage them in different questions than our own. And since C.S. Lewis and our very own Terry Boland is certainly wise in suggesting that we pay attention to the voices of dead people whose writings have proved worthwhile, rather than simply focusing on the latest publication here or there today. Since that's certainly wise, we probably ought to give it a second look. But even if you disagree about the value of old stuff in general, and even if you're not too concerned about escaping our times, this question in particular is a beneficial one. Why? Well, not because of the admittedly interesting questions of whether or not angels have rhythm, and if they do, whether they abstain from using said rhythm for religious purposes. Maybe some other time. I know I like this question, and we need this question, because it makes us think about how non-bodily persons relate to those of us who live in bodies, how non-physical beings engage a physical world. I like this question. This question matters because it forces us to ask how spirit relates to space. And if this all seems a bit academic, if it seems a little more lecture than sermon, it may help if I explain what we're trying to accomplish. We're probably going to stretch your mind a bit this morning, not just because it's fun, but because in this case, it's necessary. You see, today I want to talk about the fact that God is here. I have one goal, and that is that you will cultivate a convictional awareness of the presence of God. That's all I want to accomplish today. That you will either begin or continue to cultivate a convictional awareness of the presence of God. And this one goal is rooted in my one point, my dominant thought, my big idea, my sermon in a sentence, my portable principle. I prefer just to call it my truth. And my truth today is all that God is here. Everything true that we might say about God, we are saying about someone whose presence fills the room right now. He's here. Being here makes all the difference, as we ourselves know. My wife is here today, and to quote an old friend of mine, when she is near, my universe is at peace. And today is her birthday, and while we won't sing her happy birthday, I do have to tell you a few stories about one of our greatest gifts to one another. Those of you who know me at all will not be surprised to hear me telling stories about our daughter, Claire. Even she knows it's coming. When I come home from preaching or teaching these days, the first thing she says to me is, "Daddy, I missed you while you were gone." And the second thing she says to me is, "Daddy, did you tell them how much you loved me?" And the answer is typically yes. She came into the room the other day. Actually, we had some friends came over, and she introduced herself simply by saying, "My name is Claire, and my daddy loves me." Yeah, she's pretty confident in her place in the world. She also, not too long ago, walked in the room and declared to everyone that was listening, "Daddy, you are the king, and Mommy is the queen, and Carson is baby Jesus, and I'm the princess of the world." Yeah, we'll working on humility, you know. This summer, we visited some friends, and so we're staying in other people's houses, and we put the kiddos, Claire and my son Carson, who's 1, and we put them down in one room to take a nap, and we're in the other room doing different things. We have the monitor to kind of monitor them, and they slept for a while, but then they woke up, and we could hear them kind of going back and forth. Carson's, well, he's like a master of inarticulate groans, you know what I mean? So he's just making noises, and she's yelling at him, and we don't think much about it, because usually they work this kind of stuff out. But then we start to listen, and we look at each other, and we're going, is she saying what I think she's saying? And so then Beth walks down the hall and she puts her ear up to the door, and sure enough, she hears Carson grunting like a man. And each time he does so, Claire says the same phrase repeatedly, #, make it stop. # make it stop. It's great, man. It's great. My all-time favorite, half y'all probably heard this, but let's be honest, I don't care. My all-time favorite is the day she walked in and said, "Daddy, I'm a girl." And I said, "Yes, you are." And she said, "And you're a boy." And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "But you look like a girl." Yeah. Believe it or not, her age is still a single digit, so we enjoy a pretty uninterruptedly joyful relationship. And you won't be surprised to hear that my presence has an effect on my little girl. She knows when I'm there, she knows when I'm not. When I have to leave for a few days, or even sometimes going to work, if she's up yet, she'll say, "Daddy, I'll miss you while you're gone." And when I come home from being away, she'll say, "Daddy, I missed you while you were away." And therein lies the problem. For me to be here means I'm not also there. For me to be there means I'm not also here. I don't know if anyone's ever told you, but let me go ahead and be the first to do so. People can't be in two places at one time. And no two people can occupy the exact same space either. If I'm here, then you can be like here generally, but you can't actually be in the same space that I'm in. We all occupy one space and one space alone. We are either here or there. And if I'm here, then you're there. And if you're here, then I'm there. So what about angels? Or more to the point, what about God? See, as interested as I am on whether or not angels dance, I don't actually care about the question for its own sake. All I care about is whether or not I'm telling the truth when I say that God is here. Let me unpack my one goal for you, that we, all of us, myself included, would cultivate a convictional awareness of the presence of God. There are no wasted words, I hope, so let's just start in the middle with the word awareness. We raise awareness for all sorts of things in our world, sometimes with buckets of ice water, sometimes not. So you're familiar with the concept of raising awareness, and there's fancy definitions of awareness, but we don't really need them. Awareness is just knowing what's going on around you. So I'm raising awareness for what's going on around us all the time. I'm saying let's pursue awareness of the presence of our ever-present and always there God. And not just pursue, mind you, but cultivate. This awareness is not something that will happen automatically any more than a plant growing in a garden or than love growing between friends. It requires attention, work, cultivation. More on this when we come to the end. And also, please do not miss the word convictional. There are many kinds of awareness of God's presence, some more sensory than others. And today I'm not talking about the kind of awareness you feel. I'm not talking about the goosebumps. I mean, they're great when they come, but it's fine when they go. That will come and go, and I would advise you not giving it too much value at this point in your journey. That's not what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about an awareness of what you know is true. Think about it like this. When my Beth and I are together somewhere, we're not always touching each other. But I always know when she is near me. I always know when she's in the same city or building or house or room. I know where she is. I'm aware that she is near. And such knowledge, such awareness of presence is hardly without impact. That's what I'm talking about for you. I want you to cultivate a natural and yet transformational awareness that God is always near. This sermon doesn't stand alone, of course. We're in a series called God Is. And I don't know what it's been like for you, but for me, it's kind of been like hooking my soul up to an IV and just drinking in life and truth. It's good to think thoughts about God that are worthy of Him. Shane kicked things off for us at Convocation, talking about how God is worthy of our mission statement as an institution, which begins with the words, to glorify God. That's why we exist. Well, why wouldn't we exist, he says, given that we worship a God who we'll never be able to control. We worship a God who's inscrutable, who's ineffable, who's indescribable, who ultimately we cannot find the words to describe. So, of course, he's worthy of our efforts to glorify him. And President Proctor talked about how God is active. He sovereignly works things together such that none of us are here by accident. And one of my favorite things about Proctor's preaching is you're not just going to hear truth about God, you're going to feel the tender care of God coming through our leader. Another one of my favorite things about preaching after Proctor is that I can know with great confidence that I won't be preaching the longest sermon of the semester. That's always a little bit nice. And then if you were here with us, the upperclassmen on Thursday, Dean Doug Aldridge talked to us about God is wise. He can be trusted. He should be your primary teacher. The other Doug is up next week to close things out. Doug Welch talking about God is just. But today our focus is on our conviction that God is here. And my point is that all of these things that we're saying are not only true, but that they're true of one who is nearer to us than our very breathing. Please catch that. They are true of one who is nearer to us than our very breathing. Whatever is true about God is true about a God who is quite literally here. 4 texts we're going to examine together. We'll talk about each of them, making a few comments. Mostly they speak for themselves. And then we'll talk about how to take them seriously with one another and the rest of Scripture. If you're a note taker, we're going to be looking at Psalm 139, Psalm 46, Jeremiah 23, and Acts 17. First up, Psalm 139, verses 7 through 11. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. Here we find King David wondering if it's possible to escape the penetrating gaze of God and finding that indeed it is not. You know my every thought, he begins the psalm, and he explores this truth by meditating on God's ever-presentness. God, David says, and the rest of us with him, I can't go where you are not. Such a place does not exist. Psalm 139. In Psalm 46, we see the other side of this same truth. God, you are where I happen to be. Psalm 46, verse 1 through 3. God is our refuge and strength, and ever-present, hold on to that phrase, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. I want to talk about that phrase, ever-present. In the original language, in the Hebrew, the phrase is nimsa me'od, which could also be literally translated exceedingly findable. God, you're here, like right around me. I don't have to look hard to search for you because wherever I am, you're at. Your help is here. It's close to me and available whenever needed. So not only is God wherever you may be going, Psalm 139, God is also wherever you are, Psalm 46. One more from the Old Testament, Jeremiah 23, verses 23 and 24. Am I only a God nearby, declares the Lord, and not a God far away? Who can hide in secret places so that I cannot see them, declares the Lord? Do I not fill heaven and earth, declares the Lord? Now, the context of this one is important for our purposes. The context of this is prophets who claim to speak for God without first having heard from him. It's like they think that God won't notice when they follow up there, thus saith the Lord, with whatever it is they want to say. To those with ears, please hear. And in responding to this, God says through the prophet Jeremiah to them and us, don't think that there's anywhere where I'm not. I fill heaven and earth. The common word for this is omnipresence, although there are certain limitations with that word, though we shouldn't expect anything different. It's said that when Augustine was writing his massive book on the Trinity, he was frustrated at his inability to put into words what he had experienced and what he had learned of God, and so he decided to walk away from his work and take a walk along a nearby beach. As he did so, he noticed that there was a young boy sitting in the sand playing with a bucket, and he watched this young boy, and the young boy dug a little hole with a bucket, a few scoops of sand out on the side, and he had himself this little hole right there, and he walked out to the water, and he filled the bucket up with water, and he walked back to his hole, and he put the water in the hole, hole, and then he walked back out to the water, and he filled the bucket up with water, and he walked back to his hole and put it in his hole. And you know what happened? Most of the time, the water just sort of seeped on down, sometimes slower than others, but he did this over and over and over. And finally, Augustine interrupted him and said, "Young man, what is it that you're trying to do?" And the young boy said, "Well, I'm trying to fit the ocean into this hole." At which point, Augustine, of course, looked at him and thought to himself, well, that's kind of silly. And immediately then realized that what he was trying to do was certainly no sillier. To express the glories of our great God in containers as small and incapable as human words. So omnipresence is a limited word, but nonetheless, it will serve us well. Anyhow, the omnipresence of God is certainly not just an Old Testament doctrine. Text number 4. And if there is a primary text for this sermon, this is it. Acts 17:28a. For in him we live and move and have our being. Here we hear a truth so apparently obvious that even a Cretan got it right. I mean, our best guess is that the line comes from a poem. Now, Paul, of course, is the one speaking. He's speaking to Mars Hill, to the Areopagus. You remember this from Acts class, or you'll hear it soon enough. In Acts 17, he's talking to the intellectuals, and he's preaching the gospel to them, and he quotes this poet. Our best guess is that the line comes from a poem by Epimenides, though a case can be made for Euripides, and similar sentiments were expressed by both Seneca and Epictetus. All of that to say, first of all, please don't name your sons after Greek philosophers. Not a good idea. And secondly, what multiple pagans discovered is certainly something that we should not miss, and indeed, we should see more clearly. Most of the Acts commentaries will fail you, by the way. Mark's is somewhat of a happy exception, but most of the commentaries are content just to argue about where the line comes from, and they don't actually say anything substantial about what Paul actually says. It's pretty pathetic, really, though not unexpected, unfortunately. Much of what we think directly about God these days is, quite frankly, anemic. And I don't know if it's ignorance of our history or separation of ethics from orthodoxy or what, but lately I often find myself decrying my fear that many of our thoughts about God these days are not worthy of him. I told my Doctrine of God class last semester about a conversation I had with Claire on the way home from church one day. She had learned about who knows what, but on the way home, we're going home, and she says, Daddy, look at those trees God and Jesus made for us. It's wonderful. She doesn't know about the Holy Spirit yet. She hasn't had Acts. It will come. But she says, look at those trees God and Jesus made for us. Aren't they beautiful? I said, yeah, babe, they are beautiful. And I'm thinking, man, that's my little theologian back there. You know what I mean? Like making Daddy proud. Like, thank you, church. This is great, you know? And then she says, they're cousins. And I'm thinking, oh, no. And I probably should have let this go, but I said, yeah, the trees are cousins. And she pauses and then says, no, Daddy, God and Jesus are cousins. And I'm thinking, oh, great, I'm raising a heretic. Like, what in the world is going on? And my wife is laughing at me because she always knows what I'm going to say before I know that I'm going to say it. And I, again, should have just sort of let it slide on by, but I didn't. Instead, I corrected her, and I said, actually, Claire, God is one. To which she quickly replied, yeah, and I'm 3, and I'm going to be 4 on my birthday. And that's okay for her, because she is a child. And we are not children anymore. And it is time for our thoughts about God, among other things, to grow up. I want to talk about 3 moves I think we need to make to see this happen. If we're not going to hide from the reality of God behind half-baked exegesis, we've got to talk about some things. No, they're not points, mind you. They're more like mental habits that I think need a little tweaking in some spots, maybe some tightening up, if only to restore a bit of balance. Let's walk through these, and then I'll talk about what it's been like to live with this truth for a while. The first thing I think we need to do is, I think we need to flip our perspective on God's presence. I think we need to flip our perspective. Less God with us and more us in God. Comes straight out of Acts 17. In him we live and move and have our being. You understand that God is not part of our world that's sort of sometimes here and sometimes not. It's not like this is our universe that God somehow enters and exits as he pleases. No, this is God's world, and we are the visitors. You see, part of the issue is that we instinctively seek to find God in our presence rather than locating ourselves in his presence. And as fine and as good and as true and as biblical as it is to say that God is in our midst, it is just as biblical and perhaps more fundamental to say that we are in God's midst. His presence is the defining reality. It is we who are impermanent, even ornamental. Tozer, when talking about Jeremiah 23, says, imagine, if you would, a bucket submerged deep at the ocean floor. Is the bucket full of ocean water? Well, yeah, but it's certainly more true to say that the bucket is surrounded on each side in every direction as far as you can see by the presence of the ocean. Actually, that's not even going far enough, but it will help us get at this idea that we need to flip our perspective on God's presence. Again, while it's certainly not untrue or unbiblical, and I'm not telling you to stop saying that God is with us or God was in this place, it is just as true to say in him we live and move and have our being. And that this revelation comes in the form of poetry, and through pagans at that, is not something that bothered the Apostle Paul, and so is not something that should bother us. It is and forevermore will be Scripture. So building on the way Scripture talks about God, a second habit that I think we need to be mindful of is I think we need to distinguish presence from manifestation. We need to make a distinguishing line between God's presence and how he chooses to make his presence felt to us. So there's the fact of his presence, and then there's the felt awareness of his presence, or how his presence impacts us. A fire certainly impacts paper differently than it impacts the walls of a chimney. And God's presence, for example, will certainly impact us differently when we're obeying than when we're sinning. So God's presence manifests itself in multiple ways, but it's the same presence. And this realization can guard us against a well-meaning but misguided objection to what I'm talking about today. Well, in the Bible, God clearly comes and goes. At times he bears his arm, and yet at other times he hides his face, etc., etc. And this is true. But much of the time when the Bible speaks of God's presence in these ways, it speaks of God's presence as a readiness to bless. God being near us means a sense of his love. God being with us is about empowerment for mission, strength for battle. God being far away from us talks about this idea that, of course, not literal distance, but that because of our own actions, God is present to judge, not present to bless. Even the temple, which would be your best argument against what I'm saying. Remember, when it was dedicated, we were very careful to say out loud, now, God cannot be contained in a building such as this. He cannot be contained anywhere. No, we're talking about the manifestation of his presence in particular ways. And it is manifested in different ways based on all sorts of factors, perhaps most of all his choice and our condition. But he is always here. And the third thing I think we've got to get right is we need to acknowledge God's transcendence of space. This is actually why angels dancing on the head of a pin are worth mentioning. Again, because it forces us to ask how spirit relates to space. How does spirit relate to space? You see, one problem in all of this is that because God is definingly personal, we tend to naturally think of him as this guy living somewhere in some kind of body. Now, I don't know if it's one too many man upstairs references or where it comes from. This is actually the reason why I kind of push back on the idea of omnipresence is because it just makes it sound like God is really, really big. He's just invisible. No, that's not it. It's not just that God is large. And it's not just that God is made of a substance that penetrates other substances like a cloud or a mist. No, that's pantheism or panentheism. That God is way too small, even if huge. No, transcendence doesn't just mean that like there's space and then God's outside of it. It means that space doesn't apply to him. Tozer tells us that we think rightly about God only when we rule out the concept of space altogether. And Grudem throws in his 2 cents when he says God is a being who exists without size or dimensions in space. What we believe about God is that he has no size at all. God is not something that can be measured, not just because you don't have a device large enough, but because he is truly and technically immeasurable. Not because he's gigantic, but because he's transcendent. The polarity of here and there does not apply to him. The boundaries of space cannot bind him, and its rules do not define whatever it is he is. So everywhere we go, God is near. Not just because God comes with us, but because God is already there. Or, more accurately, because God is already here. Even while here was to us a there. God is close to everywhere because God cannot be contained anywhere. Truthfully, the word there applies to nothing in God's conscious experience of his world or himself. He is here where you aren't and here where you are. He is next to you. You are in him wherever you may be. A little confused? That you probably should be. We are talking about God's essence, or what it is that God is. And contemplating the divine essence is certainly not for the faint of heart or mind. Gregory of Nazianzus, a man who was given the nickname the theologian, once said that contemplating the divine essence is like chasing your shadow away from the sun. The faster you run, the faster it moves, ever elusive and always out in front. And like Shane said, our fathers teach us to speak truthfully about God by speaking cautiously about God, by focusing ourselves on what he is not. So it is in this vein that we say that God does not answer to the laws of space. And all this to say what we must say if we are to enjoy a convictional awareness of God's presence, and that is that we are violating no exegetical, theological, or metaphysical logic in claiming that all that God is here. Which, to many of you, is all fine and good, but who cares? Like maybe you're trying, maybe you feel guilty for thinking that, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm sure there's a way in which this matters. I'm just not kind of able to see it just yet. I'm sure this makes some kind of difference, but what kind of difference does it make, really? I mean, how could this esoteric thinking be applied? How could this be relevant to lives filled with new roommates, scary syllabi, and all the joys and temptations of being 18 to 23 years old? Or children and grandchildren, husbands and wives, scary syllabi, and all the joys and temptations of being slightly to significantly older. Well, let's start at a place where many of us either are or probably will soon find ourselves. All that God is in places of anxiety. All that God is when you are worried, when you are nervous. Psychology Today reports that anxiety disorders are actually the most common mental disorders in the United States of America. And estimates as to how much our society spends annually dealing with anxiety range from 400 million is the low estimate to 42 billion is the higher one. I'm inclined toward the higher since popular anxiety medications like Paxil and Zoloft typically achieve 5 billion in sales yearly on their own. Tragically, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention reported in May of last year that between 1999 and 2010, the suicide rate among middle-aged Americans increased over 28%. The article began with this sentence: "Suicide is an increasingly public health concern." Yeah, I'll say. Now, I know that most of you aren't middle-aged yet, but let's be honest, I don't think worry waits. I say the word school bill, and some of you start sweating, not to mention due date or relationships or, and don't disappoint us now, you hear? And we can analyze the rise of anxiety some other time. For now, let's just admit that most of us sometimes find ourselves a little anxious or worried or stressed. Re-enter Psalm 46. We will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though the world descends into chaos. Why? Because God is Nimsa Me'od, exceedingly available, because God is here. I had two experiences this past summer that I could tell you about in relation to this, but one of them involves agreeing to shop for minivans, and I'm not entirely sure I'm prepared to discuss that shift in my life, at least not publicly, so I'll tell you the other one. At the end of last semester, I was preparing for the summer, and most of you know this is my second year doing this, and so this last summer was my first year in this new rhythm, and so you have this summer open, but it's not actually open because, of course, there's a desire and an expectation to serve, and so I had lined up various, speaking things and preachings and sermons and lessons, and I'd made a list of all of the things I'd said yes to, and I'd made a plan for how far I wanted to be in preparation, and I realized on this one particular day late last semester that I had not yet reached where I wanted to be at that point in my plan. And I was a little anxious. I was a little worried. I'm thinking about all these sermons I have to write, and I only have so much to say, and I got to figure out what's going to go on in these moments. And that day, I probably stayed a little bit too late, and I distinctly remember as I'm getting up from my little table there in my office, and I'm walking around and putting my bag together and walking out the door, and just about the time I click the button on the back of the door so that it locks when it latches, I just heard from the Spirit this verse from Philippians 4. Do not be anxious about anything. Yeah, and what hit me in this particular moment as soon as the verse came to mind was the verb tense, actually. I am very much a nerd. So the verb tense is what came to mind. It's an imperative. It's a command. It's a bossy word. It's not just like a suggestion. You might want to try not being anxious about everything all the time. No, that's not what it says. It says, do not be anxious about anything. And I'm thinking about this, and it doesn't take long before I remember something one of my professors taught me, that anytime you see a command, this one included, the command is actually rooted in who God is. And then very quickly it clicked. Like, why in the world would I be nervous? Why in the world would I be worried? It just makes sense not to be anxious about anything when we are constantly cared for by one rightly described as an ever-present help in time of need, who also, just so happens to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, as we were recently reminded. I mean, when you put it like that, why would you be anxious? Anxiety doesn't stand a chance, because all that God is in places of anxiety. And all that God is in places of failure. I'm happy to report that many of those preachings and teachings this summer went quite well, but not all of them. There were a few that struggled, one in particular that just kind of flopped. I was super excited going in. I thought this was going to be a powerful message, and I preached it, and it just wasn't. And afterwards, the guy running the event was a friend of mine. He came up to me and he said, I think what he said was, we found that approach really doesn't work anymore. To which I wanted to say, thanks for being polite. I am well aware that it did not exactly connect. You know what I mean? Nothing dramatic here, just the common and somewhat deflating experience of failing at a task, relatively speaking. And I don't want to say what I have to say next. I hate to admit this, but it messed with me. It did. It got to me. From the moment it was over, it's like I wasn't in a good place. And on the way home, I had to pull over at a gas station and confess to the Lord that I still care, at least a little bit, about my name, about my rep, as stupidly silly as that is. And then as I'm confessing my sin, I look up and I see on the horizon the final glimpse of the sun just tucking right behind the tree line. And I think about the fact that happens every single day, whether I see it or not. And it hits me that as surely as the sun sets, whether in front of clouds or behind them, God is still God. And as such does not require my perfection to do his thing. All that God is in places of failure. And then lastly, all that God is in places of temptation. I need you to listen in on this because it really is quite simple. We live every moment of our lives in the presence of a God rightly described by Adam Clarke as the eternal, independent, and self-existent being. The being whose purposes and actions spring from himself without foreign motive or influence. He who is absolute in dominion, the most pure, the most simple, and the most spiritual of all essences, infinitely benevolent, beneficent, true, and holy. The cause of all being, the upholder of all things. Infinitely happy because infinitely perfect, and eternally self-sufficient, needing nothing he has made. Illimitable in his immensity, inconceivable in his mode of existence, and indescribable in his essence, known fully only to himself, because an infinite mind can be fully apprehended only by itself. In a word, a being who, from his infinite wisdom, cannot err or be deceived, and who, from his infinite goodness, can do nothing but what is eternally just and right and kind. This we believe. And so tell me, why, again, would you want to sin against this person? Like, you think this is true, and you want to leave unchecked your anger and your impatience and your pride? You believe all that, and yet you want to feast your eyes on images or put your hands on each other's bodies in ways that aren't glorifying to him? For real? Like, you want to take a hit or get a drink that breaks a covenant that you signed simply for the momentary enhancement of your state of mind? And let's just be honest, for your cool points with friends back home? Seriously? Like, you want to lie about how much time you spent reading the Bible or praying or how well you prepared for a sermon or at what time you printed out a paper? Are you sure about that? I mean, my pastor just a couple weeks ago said what we do in obedience decision moments is an exact depiction of what we believe about God. Will he notice? Will he care? Can I trust him? Is he fun? Is he here? Where do we go from here? Well, what I'm asking you to do is to cultivate a convictional awareness of the presence of God. I think this involves two things: remember and remind. First, remember. Every time you do anything, wherever you go to do it, remember that wherever you are always in the presence of all that God is. All that he is here. Every time you walk into a classroom or the chapel or the cafeteria, remember that you walk to and from and with and in a God who is infinitely wise, which means he always selects the best ends and the best mean towards those ends, infinitely strong, which means there's nothing he can't do and there are no resources to which he does not enjoy access, and infinitely kind, which means there is no limit to his desire to do you good. And every time you succeed at anything that you're doing, remember that it would be goofy for you to puff up your chest, given that you live and move and have your being in a God who is so great that we will never find words adequate to magnifying his glory. And every time you preach the gospel, whether to one or to many, you remember God's aseity, his self-existence, his independence. You remember that God does not derive being or life from anyone or anything outside himself. In other words, he doesn't need you. And every time you stop to pray, remember that the sovereign God who arranges all things for good is closer to you than the very thoughts you are struggling to find words to articulate. And every time you find yourself in a place of transition or pause, like Jacob going from Beersheba to Haran, remember his words, surely God was in this place and I knew it not. And every time you feel like no one's there or no one's for you, remember that he is here and he is for you. And when you find yourself in places of boredom or sadness or disappointment, remember that you always enjoy access to the pure joy of this Trinitarian dance. Remember that it's impossible for you to be alone and that you spend every waking and sleeping moment of your life engulfed in the presence of absolute holiness and unadulterated grace. Remember, but effort alone is probably not enough. We must indeed remember, but in order to remember, we must remind ourselves of this truth we believe. Do whatever it takes to regularly remind yourself of what you know is true. This is how you cultivate a convictional awareness of God's presence. What does this look like? Well, figure it out. To be honest, I don't really care what you do. I mean, maybe as a dorm floor, you can together decide that you'll serve as visual reminders of God's presence. So that when you see a person on the floor that you're currently living on, their presence will serve for you as a reminder of God's presence. When you see that they're here, you can remember that he's here. It's probably better than some of what may come to mind when you think about and see the people that you're trying to learn to live with. Maybe in order to symbolize his presence, you need to get a watch on your wrist that beeps every hour, or a rubber band, or maybe a ring on your finger, or maybe a tattoo, although don't give them to each other. Like, who would do that? That would be totally dumb. So I know that that's like beneath all of you. I imagine that reading the Bible every day and praying on a regular basis is probably going to be a core part of this. And maybe you also need to memorize Acts 17:28. It's kind of short. Or Psalm 139, 7 through 11. It kind of just flows off the tongue. And meditate on these things every chance you get. Like I said, I don't really care how you do it. I just care that you do it. All I care about is that whether your path is blocked or foggy or clear, whether in places of fun or frustration or fear, whether you go far away or stay very near, when it comes to this truth, all I care about is that you never forget that all that God is here.